The sky over Leningrad was often a tapestry of leaden gray, reflecting the stoic, industrial heart of the city. It was here, amidst the granite embankments and the rhythmic clamor of a metropolis striving toward a socialist future, that Alexander Snovsky entered the world on August 8, 1928. Born into a working-class family, his early years were defined by the quiet dignity of labor and the scarcity that characterized the era. "We lived very modestly," Alexander would later reflect, his voice carrying the weight of a childhood where excess was unknown. "My father worked in a factory, his hands always stained with the oil and dust of industry, and my mother did not work, dedicating herself to the impossible task of managing a household with very little." But the modest rhythm of their urban life was violently interrupted in 1941. As the shadow of the Great Patriotic War stretched across the Soviet Union and the blockade threatened to strangle Leningrad, the Snovsky family was swept up in the desperate wave of evacuations. They were relocated to the village of Velikoye pod Rybinskim in the Yaroslavl region, a place where the horizon was defined not by smokestacks but by the endless roll of fields and forests. It was here, on a collective farm, that the young Alexander found his calling. The family lived on a horse farm, and amidst the chaos of a world at war, Alexander found a profound peace in the presence of animals. He spent his days in the stables, breathing in the scent of hay and warm horseflesh, learning the language of twitches and nickers. He watched the powerful creatures work the land, their breath pluming in the cold air, and felt a connection that transcended the human cruelty ravaging the continent. That specific, tactile love for animals, for their honesty and their innocence, took root in his soul. When the guns finally fell silent and the family returned to the scars of Leningrad at the end of the war, Alexander carried that passion with him. The city was rebuilding, and Alexander, filled with the boundless anticipation of youth, enrolled in veterinary school. He saw a future of healing, a life dedicated to the creatures that had offered him solace during the exile. He threw himself into his studies, his mind filled with anatomy, physiology, and the dream of a quiet, useful life. However, the carefree existence of a student in Stalin's Russia was a fragile illusion. In 1949, the machinery of the state, paranoid and insatiable, turned its gaze upon him. Alexander was in his second year at the Veterinary Institute, a young man of 21 whose biggest concern should have been his upcoming exams. "I am very fond of animals. I have devoted my whole life to them," Alexander would later reflect, his voice carrying the weight of a childhood where excess was unknown. "My father worked in a factory, his hands always stained with the oil and dust of industry, and my mother did not work, dedicating herself to the impossible task of managing a household with a very little." It happened during a lecture on Marxism-Leninism, the ideological bedrock of the curriculum. The door opened, and the air in the room seemed to drop in temperature. "Suddenly, I was summoned," Alexander recalled. "There was no explanation, only the stern faces of men who did not answer questions." He was escorted out of the institute, away from his books and his future, and driven directly to the Big House, the colloquial, terrified name for the headquarters of the NKVD secret police in Leningrad. The building loomed over the city like a fortress of stone and secrets, a place notorious for swallowing people whole. As the heavy doors closed behind him, Alexander entered a world of inverted morality. The reason for his abduction was banal in its tragedy. A casual acquaintance had denounced him. Alexander had allegedly spoken words questioning Stalin's policies, a crime of thought and tongue that carried the weight of treason. In the eyes of the state, the veterinary student was an enemy of the people. Inside the Big House, the air smelled of stale tobacco, sweat, and old fear. Alexander was shoved into a holding cell that shattered his understanding of Soviet society. The prison population was a microcosm of the nation, a diverse and tragic tapestry. There were criminals with tattooed knuckles and hard eyes, but there were also men of intellect and culture. "In the cell, I met a very interesting person. His name was Szymanowski," Alexander remembered. Szymanowski was a doctor of science, a man of refined intellect who was an Arabist and had translated the Quran into Russian. He was serving his second term, a veteran of the system.
Alongside him sat two history students, their academic careers severed before they had truly begun. These politicals, sentenced under the infamous Article 58, became Alexander's tutors in survival.
But the camaraderie of the cell was a fleeting respite from the brutality of the investigation. Alexander was about to learn that the Soviet legal system was not designed to find the truth, but to manufacture compliance. The interrogations began, and with them, the illusion of civilization vanished. The interrogators were often sadists who treated their work with a terrifying mix of boredom and zeal. One memory remained seared into Alexander's mind, a nightmare of sensory details. A carved heavy armchair, hands cuffed behind the back of the chair. He sat there, defenseless, the wood digging into his spine. The door opened, and a giant of a man entered, a lock of hair pasted to his sweaty forehead. Beside him stood a colonel, a man whose reputation whispered through the cells like a draft. "Do you know where you've got to?" the colonel thundered. His voice was a weapon, designed to intimidate before a single blow was struck. Alexander, young and perhaps possessing the reckless bravery of the innocent, looked at him. He knew the stories. He knew the fear this man inspired. "Yes, I know," he answered, his voice trembling but distinct. "Where?" The colonel leaned in, baiting him. "To the Gestapo." The word hung in the air, a radioactive insult. It was a comparison that struck at the very heart of the Soviet victory narrative, yet felt entirely accurate to the boy handcuffed to the chair. The reaction was instantaneous. "I didn't even see the colonel's right fist flash," Alexander recalled. "There was no pain at first, just a sudden darkness. I woke up lying on the ground with the armchair. My hands and handcuffs ached terribly." This was the hammer beater, a man who treated prisoners like nails. Alexander learned the lesson of the big house through blood and bone. The beatings became a routine, a grim ritual of breaking the body to access the mind. Not long after that first encounter, the same violent interrogator struck Alexander with such force that he dislocated the young man's jaw. The simple act of eating became torture. "I couldn't eat. I could only drink water sweetened with sugar," Alexander said. He wasted away, his body becoming a cage of pain, yet his spirit remained stubbornly unbroken. Neither the humiliation nor the physical agony could wring a false confession from him. Frustrated by his resilience, the NKVD shifted tactics. They sought to break his will through isolation. "I spent 3 months in solitary confinement," Alexander recounted. "For 90 days, he existed in a stone box, cut off from human voices, from the sky, from the passage of time. He was left alone with his thoughts, the throbbing of his jaw, and the crushing silence. Even this failed. The investigators, wearied of his obstinacy and perhaps realizing they had enough fabricated evidence from the denunciation, eventually closed the file. There would be no public trial, no defense attorney, no opportunity to face his accuser. The justice was administrative and swift. When the investigation was over, I was not taken anywhere for trial. Right in the prison building, the judge and 2 observers sentenced me to 10 years in labor camps. This was the Troika, 3 officials from the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. They sat behind a desk, shuffled papers, and decided the fate of a human life in minutes. It was a factory line of sentencing. "I received the verdict indifferently," Alexander recalled. By then, the fear had eroded by exhaustion. The list of articles mentioned in the indictment didn't mean anything to me. I am not a lawyer. I was so tired of it all that all I wanted was to see people and get some fresh air. 10 years of slave labor seemed a fair trade for escaping the suffocating walls of the big house. The journey into the depths of the Gulag began under the cloak of deception. The Soviet state, obsessed with maintaining the facade of a socialist paradise, hid its victims in plain sight. I was taken away from the big house in a car with a sign saying meat or milk. I don't remember, Alexander noted with grim irony. He was treated as livestock, cargo to be shipped to the edges of the map. They took him to a transit point near Moscow, where the true scale of the repression became visible. The train station was a chaotic sea of gray faces. He was shoved into a cattle car, crowded to the point of suffocation. There was no room for me. I slept under the bunk beds, on the floor, he remembered. The floor vibrated with the rhythm of the rails, the dust choking him. As days turned into weeks and bodies shifted, he eventually graduated to a spot on the upper bunk. Through the cracks in the wooden slats, he watched the vast Russian landscape roll by, birch forests, steppes, and endless sky, realizing that the 19-year-old student he had been was gone. He was now a cog in a monstrous machine. The train carried a cross-section of the Soviet Union, young and old, peasants and professors, the guilty and the innocent. It was during this grueling transit on the Leningrad-Krasnoyarsk route that fate offered Alexander a lifeline. Lying on a bunk next to him was a man with intelligent, tired eyes, Adam Stanislavich Pashkovsky, a renowned neurosurgeon from Leningrad. Pashkovsky looked at the young man, saw his soft hands and his lack of trade skills, and offered a grim diagnosis. "Sasha, you have no expertise. It will be difficult for you in the camp. Did you learn Latin?" Alexander nodded. "In the second year, we already learned Latin and anatomy." The professor nodded, a spark of determination in his eyes. "So I'll make you a medic out of you." For the rest of the journey, amidst the stench and the noise, the cattle car became a classroom. Pashkovsky drilled Alexander on medical terms, procedures, and the bluffing required to pass as a doctor. It was a desperate education, a crash course in survival. Their destination was a project of pharaonic ambition and cruelty, the Transpolar Railway, later known to history as the Dead Track. It was one of Stalin's most tragic follies. Planned to connect the inhospitable regions of northern Siberia, Chum, Salikhard, and Igarka, the project had no economic logic, only the sheer force of totalitarian will. 80,000 prisoners were thrown against the permafrost to build 1,500 kilometers of track in a land where the ground was frozen iron. From Krasnoyarsk, the journey shifted from rail to water. For almost 2 months, Alexander and thousands of others were packed into the holds of cargo ships, sailing north down the Yenisei River beyond the Arctic Circle towards Igarka. The conditions in the holds were dantesque. There was little food, no hygiene, and a complete breakdown of law. The criminal prisoners, the orcas, ruled the dark underbelly of the ship. It was already a kind of social stratification, Alexander observed. The politicals, the enemies of the people, were at the bottom. The criminals stole their rations, their clothes, and their dignity. They gave us crisp breads and water if there was something to put it in. The others drank from a cap, for example, as one could manage.
The hierarchy extended to the guards. From the open hatches above, soldiers with machine guns looked down into the pit. A perverse economy developed. The criminals would throw their catch, stolen boots, belts, coats taken from the weaker prisoners, up to the guards. In return, the guards participated in the barter. And the soldiers in turn threw down pork fat, salami, bread, and cigarettes, Alexander recalled. It was a symbiotic relationship between the enforcers of the state and the thieves, fed by the suffering of the political prisoners. Upon arriving in Igarka, the reality of the dead track hit them with the force of the Arctic wind. The project was a disaster. The embankments, built with blood and sweat, were constantly collapsing as the permafrost melted in the short summer and heaved in the winter. The tracks twisted into useless metal ribbons. Theories abounded as to why they were there. Was it for a secret port to hide from Nazi submarines? Was it to transport nickel? In the end, it didn't matter. The work was the punishment. The climate was a lethal adversary. Winter lasted half the year, with temperatures plunging below -40 degrees Celsius. The air itself seemed to freeze, hurting the lungs with every breath. The first waves of prisoners had lived in holes dug into the ground, dying in droves. Alexander, thanks to Pashkovsky's tutelage, attempted to secure a position as a medic. For a brief moment, he wore a white coat, but the ruse could not hold. His lack of practical experience was eventually exposed, and he was stripped of his privilege. He was sent to the line. As part of the railway brigade, we were building and assembling the railway line, he said. The work was backbreaking. He was no longer a student or a medic. He was a beast of burden. My job was to hammer the staples with a long hammer. The metal rang out across the silent tundra, a monotonous tolling. The inefficiency was staggering. When rails didn't meet, there were no power tools to fix the error. So imagine what it's like to cut a rail by hand with a blade, Alexander said, his voice laced with bitter pride and disbelief. They would spend hours sawing through solid steel with hand tools, their breath icing their beards. But a Soviet man can do that too. Death was as common as the snow. The camp of 7,000 prisoners became a machine for grinding down human life. Every day, dead bodies were brought out, Alexander recalled. The morning routine involved a grim check. In the morning, they would poke a man, and he would not wake up, so they look. People slept with their heads covered. If he's got frost on his face, he's alive. If he doesn't, he's dead. The frost was the only sign that warm breath still circulated. Its absence meant the cold had claimed another victim during the night. Yet, even in this frozen hell, humanity found ways to assert itself. The camp was strictly segregated by gender, with men and women in different zones, separated by barbed wire and machine gun towers. But the drive for connection and for survival could not be extinguished. Notes were thrown over fences, and sometimes items more desperate than letters. We used to throw small bottles with liquid from the men's section into the women's, Alexander shared, revealing a tragic, intimate secret of the Gulag. The liquid was sperm. The women hoped that with its help, they would become pregnant and be freed from slave labor, at least for a while. It was a break-hardened calculus. A pregnancy meant a reprieve from the lethal work on the tracks. Expectant mothers were reassigned to the kitchens or warehouses, gaining a few months of relative safety. It was life created solely for the purpose of preserving life. For 6 years, Alexander endured. He became a creature of the North, hardened by labor and loss. Then, in 1953, the loudspeakers crackled with news that shook the foundations of the camp. Stalin was gone. The great architect of their misery was gone. The construction of the Transpolar Railway was halted almost immediately, leaving locomotives rusting on the tracks and bridges leading to nowhere, a monument to futility. But freedom was not immediate. The prisoners were shuffled like a deck of cards. Alexander was transferred further north to Dudinka and then along the separate branch line to Norilsk. Here, under a sky choked with industrial smog, prisoners mined nickel and coal, their lungs turning black in the toxic air. Finally, in 1955, the gates opened. The heavy amnesty that followed the death of Stalin and the execution of Beria reached Alexander. Unlike many who were exiled for life, he was granted the rare privilege of returning to his origins. He traveled back to Leningrad, a man of 27 years old who had lived a dozen lifetimes in the span of 6 years. Alexander Snovsky did not let the Gulag define the rest of his existence, but he never let it be forgotten. He returned to his first love, biology and animals. He worked as a zoology engineer, finding peace again in the natural world that made sense, unlike the human world, which often did not. He became a teacher, imparting knowledge to a new generation. But the shadow of the dead track remained. He dedicated his later years to memory. He wrote books detailing the absurdity and horror of the camps. He became the chairman of the St. Petersburg Organization of Victims of Political Repressions, fighting to ensure that the nearly 1 million souls swallowed by the Gulag were not erased from history.
He wanted the world to know about the rails cut by hand, the frost on the faces of the sleeping dead, and the boys who dared to call the NKVD the Gestapo. Alexander Snovsky passed away in May 2020, a witness to the darkness of the 20th century, having outlived the tyrants and the system that tried to break him.